So in our excitement to actually run that million rating script, I kind of just did it and let you watch what I did. But let's get it in writing on some slides here just to review what we did that was special about running a script on a cluster as opposed to running it locally on your desktop. So the main thing that we did was we made sure to use an empty default Spark conf object in our script. There's sort of this hierarchy of configuration settings where one will override the other. And if anything is in your script where you're hard coding a setting into your Spark conf object, that's going to take precedence over everything else. So if you left, a master of local in your Spark conf in the script, that's going to override everything else on your cluster, and your script will just run locally on your master node. That's not what you want, right? So remember to leave that empty. The next layer is going to be the actual command parameters to Spark submit. And if you specify something on the command line, that will override the configuration files for Spark itself. Now the nice thing about something like Elastic MapReduce or a properly configured Hadoop cluster that has Spark pre-installed is that you're likely to have the optimal configuration settings already in the configuration files for Spark itself. So when you spin up an EMR cluster, you don't have to tell it to run on Yarn and Hadoop and all that stuff. You don't have to tell it what other machines are available in your cluster. It just knows. And usually that's how it will work for you. But if you do need to override things, you can still do so on the Spark submit command line. So for example, you might have a really challenging job that has really big partitions for some reason, and maybe your cluster is actually struggling to keep up with it because it's exceeding the memory usage of an individual executor. So if you're not distributing your data well enough, and that can be a result of poor partitioning or just not having enough machines in your cluster, you can start to get executors failing because they're running out of memory. You're just asking them to do too much for an individual process. So for an example, you might end up passing in -- executor memory, 1 gigabyte or something as a parameter to your script when you launch it. And that will tell Spark submit, I actually want you to make sure you have at least 1 gigabyte of RAM allocated to each executor and distribute out things accordingly. Now, that will override anything in your configuration, but if you had an executor memory setting hard-coded in your script, that command line option would do nothing. So just remember that hierarchy. What's in your script takes precedence over the Spark submit command line, which takes precedence over the configuration files of Spark itself. Now, another thing that you might need to specify is the master. Now, one nice thing again about Elastic MapReduce is that this comes pre-configured, but if you do need to specify that by hand, you can tell Spark submit explicitly what to use for its master. And if you say Yarn, that tells it I'm just going to be running on top of the Yarn cluster manager that's part of Hadoop. Or it might be Mesos, or it might be a specific node that represents the master node of Spark's built-in cluster manager. Okay, so again, this will usually be set up for you ahead of time as part of the configuration, but if it looks like things aren't being distributed properly, you might need to set that. All right. So master is used to actually specify the master node of your cluster manager or the cluster manager that you're running on top of. All right, some other best practices here. If you have scripts and data someplace and you don't have a permanent cluster that's running all the time, make sure that you upload those someplace where you can quickly download them to your cluster once you've started spinning it up. Remember, time is money on Elastic MapReduce, so you want to be able to download the scripts and data that your script needs as quickly as possible. I did that by uploading my scripts and the lookup file to Amazon's S3 service, and then I could quickly use the AWS S3 command on my master node to copy those into place so I could actually run them from my master node. Obviously, you want to make sure that your data itself is also someplace accessible in some distributed file store. So I put the actual movie ratings data itself, the 1 million movie rating data set, on S3 as well. And I refer to that using S3N within my script to actually read that data from S3. Now, in the real world, you might be using HDFS or something instead. Whatever, whatever distributed file system you want to use, fine by me. All right, and once you have that all in place, all you need to do is figure out how to log into the master node of your cluster once it's been spun up. And we walk through how to do that with EMR. It's just right there in the dashboard for you, and you can use PuTTY to connect. Copy over the jar file that you want to execute, and along with any files that you need to support that jar file, run Spark submit with it, and off it goes. And the most important thing, if you're actually running on a shared cluster where you're actually renting time, like Amazon Elastic MapReduce, remember to terminate your cluster when you're done. You are being billed by the hour, by the machine, and also for any storage space that you consume. So if you forget and you leave your cluster running and you don't terminate it when you're done, and you don't stick around to make sure that it actually terminated, your bank account could be in for a very, very rude awakening at the end of the month, because AWS bills you monthly, And I can assure you, running a large cluster for a month can get very, very expensive. So if you are fiddling around with this on your own, I cannot stress enough, always make sure you've terminated your cluster when you're done with it, and don't create a cluster that's too big. AWS actually has some safeguards in place to prevent you from creating a cluster that's too expensive without special permission. So there's really only so much damage you can do, but over the course of a month, it can still add up to something pretty substantial. So please be conscious of actually what resources you're using on something like EMR. Okay, let's move on.